All right, y'all, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to welcome you back. This is our third week for having a Zoom on accountability for the Accountability Advisory Team. And I will, hang on a second, go to slideshow and get us started. All right. So two things before I even go off the first slide are, I told myself to record this time because I'm trying to figure out how I messed up the last one when I was rendering it. I had selected the wrong option. I saved it to the cloud instead of to my computer, and that created an issue when I plug it. And then the second one is next week. I'm wondering how many of you might be able to push the Zoom back to 2 o'clock instead of 1 o'clock. The reason I'm asking to do that is that there is a special working group that I belong to and several others belong to that will be talking about a lot of the work that we're currently doing, and they won't finish until 1:30. And I'm thinking that it might be better if we push it back just to 2 o'clock on Monday the 6th. So thinking about that, you can let me know in the chat if it does or if it doesn't, and then by the end we can come back and revisit that. So think about next Monday the 6th, if we can do that at 2 o'clock. Let's talk a little bit about the work. I'm going to close my door. Hang on. My poor coworkers, I'm loud enough without having the door wide open when I'm talking. So again, here we are gathering input, and today is going to be kind of an interesting day because we're going to gather input, but we're more going to have a discussion today than gathering input. And since this is our third Zoom, I'm not going to say anything about this slide except don't forget our norms and our expectations. Your perspective is valued, and we'd love to hear more. We are, again, through this process, we are reflecting on and refining our theory of action for the accountability system. And we are trying to really reimagine how we support students to advance access and opportunity. So I was in a conversation earlier today where the discussion was around school quality and labels. And, if you have,
this is drop out on the drop. Okay.
Hey, Denise, we cannot hear you anymore.
Okay, I don't know how I muted myself. I must be coming in as a participant instead of the host. So we did the survey last week, and I have to say thank you to those of you who were able to get the survey done. And what I'm going to ask you to think about as we look at partial results, because there was not enough time in my day, yesterday or today, to get all the results summarized, but I think what I have is really helpful. Be thinking about whether or not we want to continue to have it out there and try to encourage more people. So we did the survey last week, and we had a total of 17 respondents. And this first piece is on the achievement indicator. And I had to do some reverse coding to make sure that we were capturing the right numbers. So higher value equals more agreement. And that's what was taking me so much time yesterday and today is the automatic reporting options of a lot of these online software pieces aren't always clean. So I had to hand work. So for the achievement indicator, what I've got here are the average or mean ratings. 5 is the highest value, which means the most agreement. That was the happy face. And 1 is the unhappy face or the least agreement. And I'm going to take a little bit of time on this slide because the next few slides are just like this. And so understanding this information makes it easier to understand the others. What we have are bar charts that show you where those means are. So option 1 was where you have percents equal to points. Option 2, weighted performance. Option 3 was goal-based. Did they meet or did not meet the goal? That's our old system. Option 4 was matrix-based, where you get points for cells. And option 5 was a combination of index / goal combination, where you could get points for whether you're approaching the target, meeting the target, or exceeding the target. And there are a couple things to look at. You can tell that option 2 had the highest average points. If you look in the table below that, look at the standard deviations, because the larger the number in the standard deviation, the more varied the responses were. So the smaller the number for standard deviation means that there was more clustering around an agreement point. And again, you see that for option 2. And then I put in the standard error because that kind of gives you a sense of what proportion of the points you need to be significantly different from the next closest. And then I also put the medians because it looks like option 2 and option 5 were the 2 highest in terms of most people agreed that this is what they really wanted to, that they thought these were the best options for achievement indicators. So I thought that was actually really helpful information moving forward. So before I go to the next slide, thoughts, reflections, you all out there. Oh, I forgot to give Tina an opportunity to do roll call. So if you are signed in under a phone number, if you're calling in and you don't have an email that's showing your identity, if you would email Tina Smith, tina.smith@arkansas.gov, she'll make sure she gets you on the roster for participation for today. So thoughts about the indicator for achievement. Anybody? I'm working on my wait time. Sorry. I am, because I'm not good with wait time. All right, let's look at the graduation rate indicator. And here we only had 4 options. And the option that had the most agreement in terms of happy face was option 2. Again, this is where we have the index / goal combination, where you get points for approaching, meeting, or exceeding the target. And this would actually be pretty easy. That option would be pretty easy to incorporate into a variety of systems. So that's real helpful to know that that's where people are coming in. The one that's directly closest to that is the grad rate points, option number 1. And I say that because if you look at the medians, it kind of shows you that there was more agreement around, the most agreement was around option 2, but it was a little spread out. Some people either really liked it or didn't really like it. And then option 1, grad rate is equal to points within if we were using an index, then that seems to be the second option. Thoughts about graduation rate? I will tell you that by far, there was another question related to this that I haven't had a chance to write up in the slides yet. And that was, do we use the 4-year, the 5-year, or both? And pretty much everybody said we use both. So we would have to find a way to use both the 4 and the 5-year in whichever way that we brought this information together. So, thoughts?
Well, Denise, isn't it true that the state has no choice but to use the 4 because of federal regulations? So that one had to be figured in there anyway. But then we wanted to have the opportunity to use that 5-year as an option.
So that's a good comment, Danielle. So the state has to set interim measures and report on the 4-year. There's been some debate in our circles that are talking across states about whether or not that means we have to have the 4-year in the indicator, in the system that meaningfully differentiates. We have to have it as an indicator. How we use it might be up for a little bit of debate.
Oh, okay. Well, that clarifies a few things.
Yeah. So we're all still kind of, once they threw away the regulations and said the regulations are repealed and they can't be brought back in any substantively similar form, it kind of put a few things in the nebular land. We might have some flexibility, we might not, we don't. We're all still kind of talking about whether or not that means we have to do anything more than just report progress against the targets. You know, what I've heard some states talking about is using a 4-year, a 5-year, and a 6-year. I've heard some states talking about using a 5-year in place of a 4-year, and reporting, of course, the 4-year. So there's a lot of different combinations that are out there around that, but that's a good clarification. I appreciate that. Other thoughts about graduation rate before we go to the next one? And again, I will have a complete summary of this that I will send you an email, and I'll also upload it and let you know it's out there. I just couldn't get it all done today. There have been too many interruptions that couldn't be left alone. Student growth indicators, thought this was an interesting one too. The growth score equal to points, definitely not the highest. Option 2 ended up being the highest, having some combination of index and goal. So giving points for approaching, meeting, or exceeding the target. And that's kind of similar to what we did with the student growth model in the school rating system in 2015, the A through F using the value-added model. The second 2 options that came close were option 1 and option 4. And again, when you look at the medians and when you look at the standard deviations, you'll see there was a lot of agreement around option 2, but even it just seems like we have 3 viable ways that we could incorporate depending on how we combine indicators. And so that's a really good spot to be, because it could be that if we end up with a matrix-based system or portions of a matrix-based system, then we would need to go with option 4. So this is actually a good spot to be. Thoughts about this particular information before I talk more about student growth? Okay, well, again, informally, I don't have it written up, but you were able to rank the different kinds of growth models. Growth to standard came out on the bottom. A growth model that controls for input characteristics came out on the top with a transition type table kind of in the middle. And I'll end up sharing that with you in the final summary document of the survey. So this is, yeah.
This is Sarah. Can I just chime in real quick? One of the things that I was concerned with the points for approach met or exceeded is we always run into challenges when schools are right on the cusp. And if you're rounding to the 10th or to the 100th. And, you know, that was one of the reasons why I was more for just the straight points, because then you keep the veracity of the entire continuum as opposed to chunking schools into those different groups. And I think we need to think carefully about if you're that school that just misses the cutoff, if you're going to like that model as much.
That's a great point, Sarah. That's a great point. And that is, I mean, that's why we ended up with confidence intervals around safe harbor. That is something that caused so much upset under ESSA flexibility when it was purely goal-based and either you did or you didn't. So point well made and well taken. So what's interesting about this is the preferences are pretty close, and depending on where the state goes in terms of how the indicators are combined, that could definitely inform this. One of the rules of thumb that I think Pete Goldschmidt has shared numerous times in various meetings with us, and then I serve on attack with him, and he said it there as well, is whenever you do chunk things, as you said, whenever you classify and you take a continuous set of numbers, you take that full set of data and you divide it up into chunks, you lose information. And there's always going to be a dividing line. So that's something to keep in mind. And the other thing I will add, and I'm not trying to belabor the point, but another wise person that I've served on attack with has said before that when you have a dividing point, there's always a little bit of error around that point. And the number that fall below and the number that fall above generally cancel each other out, because that's what our errors around the mean generally do. So we'll have to look very carefully at classification accuracy and how we handle it in a final set of combinations if we're using some type of index goal combination. That's a good point. Oops. Hang on, we'll go to the next one. Combining indicators. This one surprised me. It didn't surprise me that goal-based system, old AYP, was at the bottom at all. That did not surprise me in the least. What surprised me is that multiple measures ended up being so high, and matrix and index pretty much are really close there. Multiple measures happens to be one of my favorites. It is very challenging to bring those together into an annual rating, but it can be done. Thoughts about this? What were some of the things, what is the appeal in the multiple measures, and other thoughts that you might have? Y'all are the least talkative group out there.
Let me ask this just for my own knowledge. What are decision rules?
Sure. Decision rules. So let me give you an example of decision rules. In the original AYP, the U.S. Department of Ed had a whole series of conditions that states had to meet in their system that they were proposing to measure whether or not schools were making adequate yearly progress. And we're actually going to talk about some of these decision rules coming up. But a decision rule would be something that you use to handle a particular circumstance. For example, when we did ESSA flexibility and AYP, you had to meet 95% of students assessed in your required groups in order to be an achieving school. Unlike a lot of state criteria. So when we look at state accountability, there's never been, I don't want to say never, but in the most recent things that I've worked with, like academic distress or rewards or things like that, there isn't a provision or a decision rule about you must assess 95% or you're not eligible. That's an example of a decision rule. So I look to see if they met the target. I look to see if they tested 95%. If they met the target and they met 95%, then the decision rule is yes, they met standards for that subject. If they met the target but did not test 95%, then the decision rule, the decision tree would be no. So you have these decisions, I want you to imagine a decision tree playing out, and at each of those joints on the tree, you have to have a series of rules that you use to handle the different contingencies. That's what we talk about when we talk about decision rules. So, and that's why when you take a state law and the state law hasn't been written fully knowledgeable of all the different nuances and decision rules that the system has to put into place to operationalize it, that's where we sometimes run into problems. That's a good question, Danielle. So interestingly enough, each of these different types of systems for combining the indicators would require us to come up with a set of decision rules about how the different pieces get defined. One decision rule would be, how would we weight each of the indicators within the system? When you look at this, you can see that an index with a multiple measures looks like it got the highest score. I'm going to put this to the side. I've got all the little things open and it's making it hard for me to see. When you look at that, again, the standard deviation around index and multiple measures is the smallest. So the most, it had the highest agreement and it had the most narrow range of scores around it, and a median of 4. So that, what's interesting there is you can have this index piece and then you can use the multiple measures to kind of play out and show where people are relative to a target. And maybe your index doesn't have the targets, but your multiple measures show whether you are approaching, meeting, or exceeding the target. So thoughts about this combination piece here? Multiple measures matrix is right up there. Or matrix.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thoughts dealing with multiple measures. There again, it's not just the academics that can be measured.
Well, it's any of the indicators that are part of the differentiating of
right.
So there's a lot of different ways that you could put that together. Because remember, we already have a minimum of 4 indicators for an elementary school and really 5 for a high school. If we're including growth, and all of our early stakeholder input has asked for growth to be included and for growth to be weighted more heavily than achievement, for example. So you've got at least 4 and 5 indicators. And within each of those indicators, we have to disaggregate by every subgroup. There are some things that are going to be they're going to lend themselves well to being included in an index. And then there are some things that if you try to put in decision rules around every single indicator and every single subgroup, it's going to get complicated. It's going to remind me too much of smart accountability. I don't know if you remember smart accountability, but we had so many different designations that it got very confusing for everybody. If you are very circumspect about what you're going to include in the index and then how you're going to take care of some of the other pieces through the reporting, the multiple measures reporting, then I think you can do both good transparency and good information, but then also a sound system for differentiating schools annually. Other thoughts, questions about this? So it looks like I ended up, it looks like I ended up jumping a little bit here because we had the systems. Nope, I didn't. We're good there. Let me talk a little bit about the 5th indicator. I do need more time to process the results from that survey. it was really neat to be able to have it so you guys could drag and drop and prioritize. But if you could see the data in the Excel sheet behind the scenes, it's a bit of a nightmare. So I will send a complete summary of those results a little bit later this week as soon as I have them pulled together. And I'll send it to you via email, and then I'll also post it in the Google folder so that everybody can have it. I do want to just put this reminder out there that as we're processing those indicators, some of the things that we will think about, and I'll include this in the summary, is do they allow for meaningful differentiation, and are they valid, reliable, comparable, and statewide within a grade span? So those are the two pieces that we'll have to apply in terms of filters. If we're good on my abbreviated survey results, I'd like to jump in to the next topic. Any last thoughts before I do?
Denise, this is Lisa Todd.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to ask if we could add one more indicator on the 5th indicators and add high school AA degrees.
I can see, yes, I can get that information added in. That kind of takes me back to my question that I want to come back to at the end too, is be thinking about this. We did have a limited number. I got 17 responses on that survey. If you think we need to keep the survey out there, I can open it back up and we can gather more results. The question I would have for you in thinking about that is, will people do it? You know, if we leave it out there one more week, do you think others will complete it? So just keep that in mind, and then that would also be an opportunity, Lisa, to add that in.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right, any other thoughts before we switch gears a little bit? All right, let's talk a little bit about long-term goals and interim measures of progress. And this is taking this directly from the statute, because the regulations I thought added additional burden. This is our charge. We have to establish ambitious state-designed long-term goals, which shall include measurements of interim progress toward meeting such goals. We have to do this for all students and separately for each subgroup of students in the state. And those goals in interim progress measures have to be at a minimum for improving academic achievement, as measured by proficiency on the annual assessments, high school graduation rates, which must include the 4-year adjusted cohort, and at the state's discretion, the 5-year, the extended year. Now, the caveat for the extended year is that we have to have a little bit more rigorous long-term goal for the longer we give students to complete their term, to complete their graduation. And we do have some good data, thanks to Dr. Jang in our office. We have some good data from which to model what those might look like. We also have to set, here's the other set of caveats. The term set by the state for the goals is the same multi-year length of time for all students and for all subgroups. So we can't say we want all students to get to this point except this group. It has to be the same length of time. And then if we have subgroups who are behind on the measures, then we have to take into, for AA and BB, we have to take into account the improvement necessary to make significant progress in closing the proficiency and graduation rate gaps. This is not unlike what they had us do with ESSA flexibility when we did individualized targets. The big difference is that the state sets the long-term goals, and we can actually situate that in reality. For English learners, there's a caveat that we have to have long-term goals and interim targets that are for increasing in the percent of students that are making progress in achieving English language. And another group is working on that particular area. So, and you can you can access that information. I'll have to get you a link that I can put in there so you can link to their Google folder because it's open to the public as well. So that's what we're charged with. This slide I put in here because I think this is where we really need to be thinking about ambitious and yet Robert Lynn, a very talented, famous education researcher at the beginning of NCLB, he was very concerned that the federal government had passed a law requiring 100% of proficiency by 2014. And he talked about how we should be setting our long-term goals aspirationally, but also situated in evidence. And he called them evidence points. And he said we should be looking at schools and saying if it's being done, so one of the things that he talked about was find the highest achieving Title I school that's out there and set their percent of students at the proficient and exceeding or the ready and exceeding level as the goal for all Title I schools. So he set an example through that. And as I've looked through what some other states are proposing, I am seeing this variety. Some are setting a baseline performance for schools that's at an aspirational percentile rank. So in other words, they're saying, whatever our baseline is, we're going to find the school that's at the 70th percentile rank. I haven't seen anybody go below that. That's why I started there. And what they're doing is they're saying at the schools at the 70th percentile rank are at 56% ready and exceeding. So we're going to use that as our target for which other schools need to get above. And then we're going to ask the subgroups to make greater progress towards that target. And then schools that are above that 70th, they still need to improve, but their rate of improvement might be slower. So they're using the original distribution along a baseline of performance to kind of set the long-term goal for all students and subgroups. So that's an option. Others are saying, well, what is the realistic percent? Let me use Ohio, for example. They are basically saying their long-term goal for academic achievement is that all schools will have 80% of their students meeting their standards at each grade level. And they're just using that. They're saying, 80% based on our criterion reference test. So that's why I put that one in there. Then there are other states who are not focusing, either they're not focusing on the academic piece, they have to have goals anyway, but they also create what's called an index-based goal. So they say, what should a B school look like? If we were all to aspire, and I put B school because you guys, nobody wants to be a C. And the desire would be for everybody to be an A or a B. And even if you talk to a B school, they tell you they want to be an A. So in discussing this idea of long-term goals, you think about what would an above average school look like? That's rather aspirational. What does that look like right now? And what would it take for all schools to get there? So you think in terms of what you would want a school to look like, and you figure out what are the different ways the components could come together, and you shoot for that. That's how you set your long-term goal and your interim targets. And I think I pretty much echoed that all the way through in here. And I'm just curious about your thoughts. I didn't put together a survey yet for this week. I intend to put a survey together around goals and targets, but I needed to hear from you guys more before I felt comfortable putting that together. I need your advice, advisory team.
This is Sarah McKenzie. I think it makes a lot of sense to use the data that we have demonstrating performance. Just picking a random percentage doesn't seem like, it seems like we're missing information. I mean, I could say, yeah, I want 100% or 76% or some number, but it seems to make more sense if we use the information that we have about schools right now, especially because we've just had our baseline ACT Aspire year.
Yeah. So looking at, you know, in reality, this is where our schools are performing. And when you look at a school, this is where we're starting. We're not going to try to make this fake trajectory to 100%. We're going to think more in terms of where's a higher performing school, where are lower performing schools, and where's a good place to shoot. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
Okay. Others. I want to give you an example around growth. When we did the 2015 A through F rating, and we were looking at the value-added growth, you know, the value-added growth comes out with basically you're looking at whether or not students met expected growth. And meeting expected growth is not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. It means you did at least what you were expected to do. And so we informally, through TIAC and other venues, we invited people to reflect on if you were making at least expected growth, what grade do you think that would represent? And that's where people came back with anything from 75 to 85% of the points. And that's how we ended up with the 80. It was kind of in the middle of that, but a low level B. You know, that's another way to think about it. You know, what is the expectation and then how is that expectation both realistic and yet still somewhat ambitious so that we're thinking in terms of improvement? I don't know if you all remember from last week the slide that I shared with you with California on the matrix, and they had performance, or they had graduation rate on the vertical part of the table. And so if you were a high graduation rate, 95% or higher, and you weren't making a lot of progress, that was okay because you had a really high graduation rate. And that's kind of what I hear you saying, Sarah, and that's kind of where my brain has been too. It's finding those good starting points, and then also finding that what is a realistic point to aspire to. Because if we do end up with something index-based or matrix-based, we're still going to have to set boundaries around the dividing line between, you know, the different categories that for support. You know, what I like about that conversation is we'll be talking about that conversation in respect to support, and not so much with respect to, oh my gosh, this is the school that's going to end up with an F, or this is the school that's going to end up with sanctions. Other thoughts? All right. Looking at the time and moving into subgroups and special topics. Again, these items I'm putting in front of you, I'm going to make them part of a simpler survey. Under special topics, we have a couple of things. We shared last week the required subgroups, and then on the survey, I asked you whether or not you thought there should be additional subgroups added to that. And here are the results from that. I want to share it in context here. So 2 out of the 17 said, don't add any additional subgroups. 5 of the respondents said gifted and talented students should be added. And then you can see some of the suggestions that were here. So everything from alternative education, Pacific Islanders, Marshallese, homeless, long-term English learners. And then the bottom category here is, I thought this was interesting, reporting only. So in other words, for the sake of transparency and for helping us to be mindful of it, students not reading by grade 3, since we do have, you know, Arkansas Rise, or Rise Arkansas, the reading initiative, it might be smart to be reporting on that, particularly since our current indicator of English language arts is a combined score, and reading itself is not reported on. So that might be a really nice piece to add on the reporting side. And then the graduation rates of students who are not on grade level in grade 8. That's interesting too. I guess thinking about the idea that if you're not on grade level by grade 8, what does that do to your graduation rates? And are we recapturing those kids? So interesting thoughts about those subgroup survey results. Anybody have a comment, question? All right.
Denise,
Yes.
question. So on that one about students not reading by third grade, not reading like a non-reader, there's also the aspect of they may be on a first grade reading level.
Right.
So would we consider just they're not on grade level for third grade?
That would be my assumption, but I did not. So the extras are what people added in. And my assumption would be that they meant that they're not on level by grade 3.
Gotcha.
So there's so much research around that if kids aren't on grade level by grade 3, they're basically behind the 8 ball going into middle school and being able to do content level reading. That would make sense. Other thoughts? All right. So, other special topics. This is an important one that nobody really talked about. And what was interesting to me is when they did have the regulations, there were very few states who submitted any information about this. ESSA allows you to include former children with disabilities, kids who have exited the disability subgroup for the purposes of calculating the indicator for that subgroup. Under AYP and under ESSA flexibility, Arkansas gave schools the option to do this for up to 2 calendar years because that's how the law was structured. And Arkansas was actually really lucky because we got in and we were doing a procedure before a lot of other states were to take advantage of this. And nobody ever came back and said you can't do it that way. However, I've learned since then that other states, basically it's all or none. So we have to describe a statewide uniform procedure for including these students in the students with disability subgroup. And we have to think about, if we want to do that as a state, how many years we want to include those students. Over the years, this has been fewer than 50 kids a year under our old process, which was when schools basically would request to include these kids based on appeals. It's my understanding, and I'm still trying to get clarification on this, that if Arkansas chooses to do this going forward, that it wouldn't be a choice procedure. We would either include all of them that exited within a certain amount of time or not include all of them. Does that make sense? What are your thoughts about this, you guys?
Denise,
Yes.
this is Mel.
Yeah.
Having worked with many of our districts on this, if we have data that we could model and look at, and unless that data, we've changed assessment since we did the AYP, where we had a lot of people appeal, like maybe students that were identified as SPED students that were being served for speech services only, and then they exited, and then there was a lot of appeals. We saw everything from that having a great impact on the proficiency of that special ed sub-pop. We also saw situations where they created a sub-pop.
Yes, exactly.
That may be a little different with a higher end size than what we saw in there, but I'm just trying to reflect on some of the things I remember from when we had that.
Yep, those are really good points, and those are really good points. I do have some data on English learners because that has been a group in and of itself. So we've got some good information on that I can share with you that kind of brings forward exactly what you're talking about. The problem with, if we were to model based on what was done before, the numbers of exited special ed students are so low that we wouldn't really get any, like I said, it's, you know, I want to say it was somewhere between 25 and 30 last year, which is the only year we have Aspire data for. What we could look at is based on exit date, if we had to include all. I'm writing a note here.
But don't we also use the MSAA results?
Yes, yes, yes. But MSAA, they're all members of that group, right?
I just know that the performance at looking across the state, the performance has been more challenged than it was historically.
Definitely.
That data, it would help me to see what it looks like if it were modeled based upon Aspire and MSAA over what I remember it to look like under different standards and different assessment measures.
Sure, sure. That's a good point. So I'm writing that one down, and so hold on to that because I want to show you what we did with the EL group. But before I move on to that, does anybody else have thoughts like that? Mel is spot on in that sometimes when you add those kids in, you create a subpopulation that you didn't have before. And I want to talk more about that when I share some of the minimum end data. Well, maybe it'll help to look at it with the EL group, because the question of should we include former English learners in the English learner subgroup for purposes of calculating any indicator that uses data based on their assessment, the content assessment, for up to 4 years. And the advisory team says yes, they want to include for up to 4 years. So what we will end up doing, and that team will be working on this, is describing a statewide uniform procedure for that. And again, unlike in prior years, where you basically said on appeal, yes, include the student, this would be an all or nothing. So we would include them for up to 4 years. I say we, but the requirement is there. They strongly recommend English learners for up to 4 years. And then the other thing that they were very strong about when it comes to subgroup performance was on the reporting side, on this idea of multiple measures. They really think it's important for schools to see their data broken down in these groups. And I'll show you what it looks like. So you have the recently arrives. Of course, there you'd be lagging a year unless the decision was made. You can show them for math and for science, but to show them for ELA, they'd have to take the test. Then you'd have your current English learners, and then English learners with disabilities. We don't have that one quite yet. Former English learners in the group. Let me show you what it looks like. It's easier to talk about it with the data. So to the very left, this is statewide. And these differences, although they look like small percentages, because of the N size, because of the number of students, it's very significant. And when you look at this at the school level, it's very significant, even though it's smaller numbers, because those kids add something really good to the group. So on the very left, you see English learners only. So this is the performance on the Aspire of English learners on Aspire plus MSAA. If they're listed as an English learner, they're in this statistic. So you can see 32% in math, ready or exceeding, and 29, almost 30% in English language arts. What we've been doing for accountability in prior years is the second set of bars, the English learners plus 2 years of students that are former English learners. Now that's always been based on, in the past it was based on people opting those students in. These data are based on exit dates. So looking at it and saying it's all or nothing, and it still improves the performance overall. You can see 4 year gets you a slight bump over 2 year. And the reason is that even though the numbers of the former, and you can see that we're only talking about 2,000 kids, we only add about 600 more kids statewide when we go to 4 year, but those students are predominantly achieving at a higher level than even their English only peers when they come out of this as a English proficient student, which all the data that we're running, it's just fascinating to see this. When they get to a certain proficiency level in English, they're actually, their performance distribution is actually better than the performance distribution of their English only peers. They're definitely, while they're learning English, at a lower point, but once they get to that English level, they're at a higher point. Questions about this chart, because it can be a little confusing if it's the first time you look at it. Can you see why the advisory group is wanting to go the full 4-year time frame? It makes data sense. The other piece that is a special topic for subgroups, and again, the English language learners, the English learner advisory team is working on this as well, as there's really 2 options for what to do with students who are recently arrived in the US. And one is to do what we've been doing, which is to exclude that English learner from one administration of the English language arts assessment. They still have to take math and science, and you could exclude the student's results on math from the first year as an English learner in the US for the purposes of accountability. The second option is to do more of a 3-phase. In the first option, which is what has been the only option, you don't test them in English language arts content. You have to test them on the English language acquisition. And then a year later, you have to include them in accountability, regardless of their English language learning level. The choice we have now is we can assess them on English language arts on the content test. That information is not used in accountability at all that first year. You exclude the results for English language arts in accountability. In the second year, you would include that student in accountability, but only with a growth score. And then in the third year, you would have to start including their proficiency on the English language arts content test. So option number 1 is how it's been. Option number 2 is something new and different. And I'm just curious your thoughts as a group. Again, I'll put a survey together, but which way would you lean on these 2? Nobody has an opinion?
Well, I would go with the several years instead of the first, where they're excluded the first year, and then they're included in growth the next year, and then they're included in proficiency after that.
Gotcha.
I mean, I think that that's a better model than the first one.
So they would have to test that first year they're in the US. One of the things I was sharing with somebody is that the data that we have in Arkansas for English learners shows us that not all recently arrived students come in at the lowest levels of English speaking, and that their level of English learning, so if they are emerging, approaching, or proficient on English language acquisition, if they come in as a level 1, they do tend to be lower performing on content. But if they come in as a level 2 or a level 3, some of those students are doing really well. And excluding them can be almost counter to helping your data. So it still gets you in that catch-22 that Melody was talking about. But a lot of those kids also tend to be mobile. So they end up, you get results in that first year that you can use for growth the next year, etc. So good thought. Others besides Danielle?
Well, if we, let me mute this phone.
I know.
The first one is what we've been doing, where we've exempted them from certain parts of the test.
Yep.
And then the next year they had to go full-fledged, no
That's
matter what.
Yep.
Thrown in. And so if we, who's that? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so the change would be if the state opts to go with number 2. this II. I shouldn't say number 2. It's II. Lowercase I, lowercase I.
Denise, this is Mel again. So one of the concerns about staying with the Roman or letter I, whatever, is recent arrivals who are level 1s are required to be assessed on math. And, you know, there is a strong correlation between reading and math scores with Aspire. And so it's hard to understand why you would exempt them from reading or language arts, but not consider that as a possible need for math as well. And so that's, I guess that missing from that option is why I would lean towards II.
Gotcha. Yeah, because we don't have a choice about those other subjects. You're right. Although the data do show that they tend to do slightly better on math than they do on English once they get to that level 2 on proficiency. So anybody else want to weigh in on this before we look a little further?
I just want to completely echo what Melody said. I know with our kiddos, that's exactly what we see. You know, they're exempt from that literacy portion, but there's such a correlation between the scores on the 2 tests. So I just want to echo what she said. I think that it would be beneficial for those students because of that correlation and because of their language skills. There's so much on the test that they're still having to read and interpret.
Gotcha. No, those are good points.
Denise,
So
this
that,
is Ashley Daniel.
yeah.
Hi, can you just clarify for me on that BB? Does that mean that the students have to go ahead and take the assessment in year 1
Yes.
in order to have a growth score? Okay.
That is correct. And
Included.
that's the interesting thing about this. Option number 1, they don't take the English language arts test, but as Melody pointed out and Regina, they still have to take math and science. Under option number 2, they still take, they take all 3 of the content assessments, English language arts, math, and science. The difference is that in that first year, you're not using those results for the state determined accountability system. And then in the second year, you only use the growth in those areas. And then in the third year, you bring them into the academic achievement indicator.
Is it where we'll have to appeal to exclude them, or so they will be included initially?
Oh, you know, Ashley, that is such a great question. And I know that Tricia Kerr's group is keeping a running record of the issues that come out of their advisory team, how that will impact data collection. So one of the examples is there is an indicator already in the system that a student is first year in the US, and that is their entry date. And that entry date is supposed to be the entry date for the first time that student entered a US school. So it's possible, if those data in that part of eSchool are accurate, that could be used so that you wouldn't have to. So if the state said, we're going to do lowercase, the II option, if the state said, this is the option we're going to use, then that entry date and the accuracy of that entry date would be really important, because that's how the state would determine that this is a first year in the US student, and not have them, well, you would expect them to test, but then we would have a way to exclude them. So basically what you would be doing is checking on that data during the corrections process, not necessarily having to indicate that data.
My thought here is that not all first year US are L1s. So does that also mean we have the option to include?
That is a good question, Ashley, and I don't know the answer to that. We have had the option to do some things that other states have told us that we were lucky we got in on them when we did. And some of what you're talking about is one of those, having this option to say, yes, include it. So we would need to get more information about that, but what you're doing is you're helping me build a good survey.
Okay.
for this. So can we opt in to count if indicated by school or district? So making that counting as optional, because right now you could make them count by having them take the test. Isn't that correct? I'm not quite sure. Or by
Yes,
not
we
using
had
them.
to go through and exclude them with appeals.
I gotcha. Okay. Or use that reason not tested code. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Oh, this is very helpful, you guys.
Denise, this is Cheryl Gall.
Uh-huh.
In regards to the ELs, could they take the test with modifications, and that modification being to assess in their native language?
So it's my understanding, and Hope Allen and Tricia would be the ones to tell you this, but it's my understanding that Arkansas is an English-only state, and so we do not allow assessments in their native language, and that's a statutory thing. So they can take the test with accommodations, but it's my understanding the reason that tests in the other language don't exist in Arkansas is because of our English-only state law. Definitely talk to your legislators about that. Good question, Cheryl. That was a good question. Yes. All right. So minimum N for subgroups. I wanted to refer you really quickly to these data because we will be putting together, again, a survey around these special topics. What I've linked to is what's already out there. It's in the preparation materials in our folder. It's from the ESSA Steering Committee presentations, and this gives you a sense of the number of schools, given the 2016 data, who would be accountable for certain subgroups under a variety of options for subgroups. And you can see it's a pretty intense set of information, and you're free to look through that. It's been out there now for several months in a variety of different forms. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but the groups, let me see if I put this in here, that tend to be the least represented, and they do have different clusters across the state, are special ed, African American students, and English learners. And those three groups tend to be the three groups that large schools are accountable for and small schools are not under our current minimum N. And the big difference being that when you look at special education, it's pretty linear. You get to a certain point, you're going to include all those kids. Even dropping, you have schools that have fewer than 15 that would still not be included. So thinking about where do you see these clusters of students, what schools in the English Learner Advisory Team this morning, their concern is they want schools that may not have a big group of English learners to be eligible for supports under ESSA, that if the minimum N is too high, they won't be eligible for those supports for English language instruction. So I do want to point out that the information breaks it down by grade level. Under our old higher minimum ends, what we had was middle schools really getting the bulk of the accountability for certain groups, particularly special ed. I do want to take you to some newer slides that we put together based on some information that Lewis had shared with me. Lewis, if you're out there somewhere, Lewis had shared what Ohio had done in terms of its study on minimum N. And Ohio is actually going with a minimum N of 15. And one of the reasons that they're talking about that is because of equity for the size of schools and districts. Let's see. So this is the effect of the minimum on who's accountable for graduation rate at the high school level. And with graduation rate, you can see that, so what you have here is the number of schools on the left, and on the right, you see the same information provided through percentages. And then the number of subgroups is the horizontal axis. And the color of the line tells you the minimum ends. So as a line peaks, it shows you that at, let's see, that N of 30, you're always going to have a percentage of really large schools and really large districts that are accountable for almost all of the subgroups. As you decrease your minimum N below 25, you start to see some mitigating of that effect. I think it's easier to see when you look at English language arts and math. And in particular, when you look at percentages of schools, these top two charts, you've got the percent of the group, let's see, for the race categories, and then the percent for the non-race categories, which are the economically disadvantaged, English learners, and students with disabilities. And it's interesting, every state always has to run their own data. So Ohio may have run this, but their charts may have looked different from ours. When we run it, we actually do get some similarities converging around that 15 for a minimum N. And for me, it was interesting that it flipped this from, in the past, we always thought about raising the minimum N in order to have equity for the large schools, when in fact, the opposite is really true. Because the large schools are accountable no matter what. It's the small schools that may have a cluster of students that they're working with. And if you think about this as eligibility for support versus identification for shaming and labeling, it's a very different mindset. So I'm not going to belabor this. I want to put this information out there for you to review. And again, I think we're going to have to revisit it next week. But between this week and next week, I am going to put together a survey around these special topics and subgroups, the minimum N. And again, when you can download the PowerPoint, it's out there now in the folder. You can see the difference in terms of what it does for districts and what it does for schools in terms of those different sizes of minimum N in both math and ELA. Thoughts or questions before I move on? Anything that I haven't been thinking about as I'm verbalizing to you all to put into a survey around this? I know we're past time, so I appreciate anybody who's hanging on. All right. So English language proficiency progress indicator, again, I think I've already said that they want to include as many schools as possible so that they can be eligible for support. And then we did look at ELDA data. And again, because the English language acquisition indicator is going to be impacted by minimum N. And what we're hearing and what Tricia reiterated this morning was that some states are looking at having a minimum N for subgroups and then a minimum N that is different for the indicator of English language acquisition. So we can discuss some of that, but this gives you data relative to the percentage of schools that actually have English language learners who are taking the ELDA or the ELPA. The reason for putting 3 years in here is you can see how that data has changed. It hasn't changed that much over the years. And with that, I just want to stop. I want to find out, do you think I should put the survey out, leave it out there for another week, or even through maybe Thursday? So I have I'm not going to get a chance to do this work on Friday. Just giving more people. Do you think people will complete the survey if we leave it out longer? And the second thing is, it looks like 2 o'clock works for most of you guys. So if you're okay with that, I'd like to do next week at 2 o'clock, and I'll get that reminder, that switch in time out for everybody.
I would suggest that we leave the survey out just a little bit longer.
All right. Can you encourage people to get in there?
Yes, I have a couple of people that would have liked to, and I didn't get them the word in time, so that would be helpful.
That would be great. And also, one of the things I noticed is that there were 26 responses in progress, which means that somebody started but didn't finish. And I opened the window for finishing so that if they started and were like, oh, I ran out of time, I think they can still go back in and finish. So they don't have to retake the whole thing. All right, so I'm going to leave that out there through what's a good stop date. Lisa, if I stop on by Thursday, like the end of the day Thursday, is that enough time?
Yes, I think that would be sufficient. That'd
Okay.
be great.
Denise, is there any way you could stretch it through Friday? We have a lot of district leaders that would like to do it, and they're tied up in meetings in Little Rock this week.
Oh, okay. So Friday, close of business. I'm having such fun weekends with all this, you guys. Sorry. But I'm willing to do it because it's really important. So, and I'm telling you, I think stakeholder input this is the first time that I've seen them really focus on being responsive to stakeholder input. So I'm excited about it. All right, so Friday, close of business. Any other thoughts before we sign off? All right, you all, thank you so much for listening in. And I'll start working on the survey for the other topics and working on the topics that are left for us to address. And we'll go from there. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate you. All right. Okay. All right, I'm going to end the meeting and stop the recording. Thank you so much, everybody. Is that